Welcome to Unbiased Science, where we bring scientific method to the madness. I'm your host and public health scientist, Dr. Jess Steyer. And today we are going to talk about measles. So measles, once on the brink of eradication in the US, is making a dangerous comeback, especially in communities with low vaccination rates. This is happening in the US, but also elsewhere around the globe. So much so that the latest measles outbreak jeopardizes the US's progress toward measles elimination. Despite the availability of safe and effective vaccines, measles cases have been on the rise, in large part due to vaccine hesitancy and misinformation. We must work together to reignite a culture of immunization in the U.S. by addressing parents' vaccine questions and concerns to safeguard the strides we've made in preventing and even eliminating dangerous diseases. And unfortunately, just last week, news broke that an unvaccinated child under the age of 5 died from measles in Ontario, Canada, just underscoring that this isn't, I think some people write off measles as, just a skin rash or something, not serious. And that's sort of because we're a victim of our own success, right? Because vaccines have been so successful. And unfortunately, these gaps in vaccine uptake have threatened our progress. So today I am joined by a very special guest, Serese Marotta. I hope I'm saying that correctly, even though I practice. Hi, Serese.
That was perfect.
So just a brief background on Serese. Serese is a 20-plus year public health expert and former scientist, and we're going to talk a little bit about her journey. She's currently the Director of Advocacy and Education at Vaccinate Your Family. She works closely with community health workers on the ground amidst this challenging measles outbreak landscape, and brings a unique perspective through her ongoing work. Additionally, Serese is a personal advocate for immunizations whose work is inspired by the loss of her son, Joseph, to a vaccine-preventable disease. Serese, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. Very pleased to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you mentioned that you have a background in science, but also your personal journey of becoming involved in advocacy and education.
Sure. So, I was, for the better part of 2 decades, a scientist. My main focus was conducting human health and ecological risk assessments, which means I was looking at environmental exposure of both humans and animals to chemicals in various media, be it soil, sediment, surface water, groundwater. So worked really closely with engineers to figure out, was there a risk? Was there a hazard to either people or animals? And if there was, how are we going to clean it up? So really already worked in that public health space for almost 2 decades. About 15 years ago, I unfortunately lost my healthy 5-year-old son, Joseph, to flu during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. So I kind of pivoted in the public health space and became more and more involved in the immunization space. And then that eventually became my career. And henceforth, I am now working at Vaccinate Your Family. And it was really my personal journey that, let my personal passion that led me to this, because, this happens to you and you think, oh my goodness, am I the only one? And then you find out you're not. And your mission in life then becomes to make sure that it doesn't happen to other people.
I just have to take a moment to say I'm so very sorry, for your loss. I can't even process that. As a mother, I just such an unimaginable loss, and I think you're really honoring your son's memory by doing this important, meaningful work that is changing the lives of so many. So thank you so much for what you're doing. So, Serese, can I ask, I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you, but Were you vaccine hesitant at any point in your life?
No, and I'll tell you just a little bit about Joseph's story. So, Joseph, I have always been pro vaccine. I think as a scientist, as a protective mother, I was vaccinated as a child. I just looked at vaccines and thought about vaccines as this is something that you do.
Right.
So, Joseph, during the fall of 2009, he actually did receive the seasonal flu vaccine. But that vaccine did not offer protection against the pandemic strain of H1N1. So I don't know if you remember, but in 2009, the monovalent flu vaccine came out, unfortunately, after, in my community at least, after Joseph passed away. So, although he was vaccinated, he essentially, like so many others, did not have protection against H1N1. And of
Mm,
course, because he was young too. So, he had no previous exposure to rely on like some older adults did.
right,
So,
right.
always pro vaccine, but certainly, I can tell you honestly, probably one of the most important points I always share about Joseph's story is he was in the hospital for 10 days. After he passed away in the ICU, I remember looking at the attending physician and she said, he's the 85th child to die from flu this year. And I said, children don't die from flu. I literally had not heard of this happening. I thought it only happened to older adults. Um, how wrong was I? And it was just, you don't know what you don't know. And so that for me was it was an eye opening moment for sure.
So, Cerise, one of the things I find so powerful about your story is that despite the fact that Joseph was vaccinated, right, against the
Mhm.
flu, and he still passed away from flu, that you continue to be an advocate for vaccines, including the flu vaccine, which is a testament to your understanding. And of course, the fact that vaccines are not magic bullets, right? And right, and they're not perfect. Anyone who claims that they're perfect or 100% effective is ill-informed. That's not accurate. And I know you mentioned a little bit about vaccine technology and that being a monovalent. Now the flu vaccine is interesting. The vaccines are going through a change right now where they
Right.
were previously quadrivalent, but because one of the strains, the Yamagata strain, that was one of the strains that the flu vaccine protects against, it has not been detected in years. They're removing that from the formulation. It will now be trivalent moving forward. So I have some content in the works to help, to help inform people about that shift. So let's shift a little bit to measles specifically.
Mhm.
I'm sort of blown away that this is something that we're even talking about now. It feels like we're really regressing. And I know for so many of us, it's so frustrating because we know we have this incredible tool, the MMR vaccine, which after 2 doses is 97% effective. And that now we're still seeing these cases crop up. And again, this terrible case out of Canada of the child fatality. So
Mhm.
why is measles in particular raising so many alarms in the public health world right now?
Well, I think what we're seeing is unfortunately a result of declining vaccination rates. So we know measles is very contagious, if not the most contagious infectious disease. 9 out of 10 people who are exposed, if they're not protected adequately, will become infected. So it's very concerning because, like you said, back in 2000, the US declared like measles was eliminated. We did not have continuous disease transmission for over 12 months. We now are, at 139 cases in 2024. We've got 10 outbreaks in 20 states. It's just really kind of incredulous. And what that shows us is number one, how infectious measles can be. And number two, what are the impacts when we even see just a slight decline in vaccination rates, right?
Mhm.
So the CDC obviously puts out their data for the 22-23 year. We went from 95% coverage rate to 93. That is just enough. It doesn't seem like much in the context of things, right? We're thinking like, oh, it's 1%, it's 2%, it's not a big deal. But this is what we're seeing with these measles outbreaks shows us it's a big deal. When
Well,
we
and
have
it's such, oh,
people
I'm
who aren't
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, when we have people who aren't vaccinated, unfortunately, and again, whether that's people we're exposed to in the community, these diseases are only a plane ride away. We have people coming in from outside the country.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Mm-hmm.
what happens.
Well, and you alluded to it, the contagion factor, the R naught for measles is just, it's so high. It's so highly infectious and contagious. That's why even these small dips in vaccine uptake make a huge difference. So, Serese, can you maybe just talk a little bit, because some people will say, well, if the vaccine is so effective, why does it matter, if my kid doesn't get the vaccine? If it's so effective, your kid will be protected. So maybe just talking a little bit about the concept of herd immunity, which I have spoken about before, and we have lots of posts if you want to search our database. But I think it's an important question and one that we should address.
It is. I like to say vaccination is a team sport. I actually didn't coin that phrase. Someone shared it with me years ago, and I was like, that is exactly a perfect way to put it. And when I tell Joseph's story, I always say, I don't know who his patient zero was, right? Somebody gave Joseph the flu virus. Unfortunately, he passed away. So for me, when I get vaccinated, when I make sure that my family members are vaccinated, it's not just because obviously I want to stay healthy. It's because I feel a responsibility to other people that I may come into contact with, whether that's my loved ones, it's community members. So vaccination and herd immunity, community immunity, whatever we want to call it, is really important because there are also people in our communities who can't get vaccinated for whatever reason, right? Maybe they're going through cancer treatment, or maybe they're immunocompromised. For whatever reason, it's up to us to help protect those people that are especially vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just, it's a way for us to help take care of one another. That's the way I think about it.
So, Cerise, I want to learn more about Vaccinate Your Family. My understanding is that you're doing, or you work with community organizations, community health workers. I'm curious to hear about some of the work that you're doing, the approaches that you take. Through Unbiased Science, I do a lot of communication directly to the public, but I think it's quite powerful that you work with these community-based organizations, because then they can serve as trusted messengers, right, and really deploy messages to the communities that they serve. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So one of our key programs we have is called the Vaccination Community Navigator Program. And this was created for community health workers by community health workers. And community health workers are people from their community. They represent their community, and they're out there doing the work on the ground to educate their community members, not just about vaccines, obviously, about health and wellness, various topics. But community health workers they play a really important part in the healthcare landscape. Because especially when we talk about underserved populations, people who may live in rural areas, or people who live in areas where access is an issue, community health workers did such important work during the COVID-19 pandemic that we really felt compelled to make sure that they were represented and supported. So the Vaccination Community Navigator Program was something that we collaborated with one of our partners on, Dia de la Mujer Latina, down in
Yes,
Texas.
you know them so well. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so Venus Genus and my colleague Robin Carell actually got together. And I should say, we have two community health workers and community health worker instructors on staff here at Vaccinate Your Family. Robin is one, and Marlene Ramirez is another one. I mean, that's how serious we're taking it. Like, these folks are really important. So Robin and Venus at DML got together in September of 22 and did a pilot program down in Texas. And it was wildly successful, so much so that we received some funding last year to launch it nationwide. And it has just been tremendous. And so definitely, we're continuing to push that forward. But the idea behind it is to support community health workers. And with these measles outbreaks, we're hearing on the ground, like they're concerned, they're getting questions. They're like, what are we telling people? Is this going to be as bad as COVID? People are asking us. So it's really important to us through this program that we're not only providing them with educational offerings, we have a 4-part core curriculum, but we also have community of practice meetings. We have an online community where they can come and share resources and collaborate. And it's just a way for us to kind of keep those connections going and make sure that people have the tools and the resources at the community level that are needed.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons for vaccine hesitancy. And, and this is really, I just want to set the stage here. I'm not pointing fingers at certain, communities where we do see uptake is lower. There are certain faith-based communities where we're seeing uptake is lower, for example. And it really does take a very tailored approach because, and I'm just going to go off on a little tangent here, but we did a flu vaccine education campaign and it was all data driven, right? So we kicked things off with surveys and focus groups to really first, of course, identify which groups were the most vaccine hesitant and then understand the reasons for hesitancy. And just skipping ahead here to make a long story short, there were really 2 key groups that emerged. One was African Americans, regardless of age or gender. And then the second was young white men living primarily in the rural South and Midwestern regions of the US. And then when we dug in deeper, we did some qualitative research, some focus groups to really understand the reasons for hesitancy. They were totally different. I mean, I'm sure this is not all that surprising to you, Serese, or to our listeners, but the African-American participants really voiced concern about the ingredients. What is being put in my body? This is a population that is understandably distrustful of the scientific and medical establishment based on horrible things in our past, like the Tuskegee, syphilis experiment and all kinds of other examples that I could give. And so it was really interesting to hear, genuine concern about ingredients, right? But then for the young white men, it was a completely different story. It was much more libertarian concerns about, freedom, and I don't want to be told that I have to get a vaccine. So a lot of concerns about vaccine mandates, but then also it tied back to this mistrust of government, in particular the CDC and the FDA. So I think it's really cool what you're doing, this community-based approach, because then those organizations can tailor their education, their outreach, their engagement based on the specific concerns about their communities. So can you share a little bit about what you're hearing from the partners that you're working with boots on the ground? What are some of the concerns that you're hearing?
Yeah, I think you highlighted a lot of really broad concerns that go across the spectrum when we're talking about immunizations. I think trust is definitely a big one. And I'm so glad you brought that up because that is, community health workers are trusted messengers. Trust is such a big issue. And look, I get it. There's a lot of information and misinformation, and people are like, who do I trust? Where do I go for credible information?
Right.
So that's totally understandable. In terms of their concerns about vaccines, safety and effectiveness continue to be those top concerns. I think when we work with trusted messengers at the community level, to your point, we have to, number one, what are the barriers, right? Because it's not a one size fits all. When we talk about campaigns and education, we're like, okay, who's the audience? Because it's not just this cookie cutter thing that we're going to go out there with. We have to really make sure, are these materials culturally and linguistically appropriate? Who's delivering the message, right? So all of those things are really important. But I think trust continues to rise to the top when we talk about vaccine confidence. It's, confidence not only in the vaccines, but to your point again, the people who are recommending the vaccines.
Right.
We also have to think about access. One thing that kind of, when someone says vaccine hesitancy, I'm always like, well, wait a second. Sometimes it's simply a matter of convenience and access. There are so many people who are like, I just didn't get a vaccine because it wasn't high on my list, or I went to my doctor and he didn't stock the vaccine and I couldn't make it to the pharmacy, or there's not a pharmacy near me, right? So we have to really drill down to what are those barriers.
I am so happy that you're saying that. And I want to call out a friend of mine, an amazing science communicator, Dr. Nini Munoz. She runs the page Nini and the Brain. And she just did this really fantastic post. I'll link to it in our show notes about anti-vax and vaccine hesitancy. And then to your point, Serese, there's also this access issue. I worry, and I've honestly been guilty of this in the past, that a lot of us with science backgrounds we get very frustrated, right? When we see uptake drop and vaccine rates drop. It's like, what's wrong with you? We have this amazing tool. Why aren't you getting it? But it's often a lot more nuanced, a lot more complex. I think that we have to do better as scientists and science communicators, that we can't just write people off, because there are some really legitimate questions and concerns. And as a parent, we want to make sure that what we're putting in our child's body is safe and it's been studied and we're not, doing harm. So I get it. And I think overall, that's why I love hearing you speak and the work you're doing. You're really driven by empathy. And the goal is to help educate people, break down barriers, and get those vaccine rates up. But you're not coming from this place of judgment or this like top down, like you have to do this, because that people do not respond well to, and it's understandable, right? So Keep up the good work there, Serese. That's amazing.
Exactly.
So, what do you see as the biggest challenges and threats to vaccine-preventable diseases today in 2024?
Oh gosh, there's a list. I will try to kind of give you my top few. I think misinformation continues to be a problem, right? Again, people need to know, where can they go for credible, evidence-based information? So and the people that are pushing that mis and disinformation, they're quite savvy, right? So we're doing what we can to educate folks, but I think misinformation continues to be an obstacle that we will continue to wrestle with. I think in terms of trust, again, working with people and not just to your point, going in and telling them what to do, but involving them in the beginning, giving them a seat at the table in the beginning, at the planning stages, right? And a lot of it is listening. We have the expertise, but so much of it is just going in and listening. What is going on? What are your concerns? And look, it's okay to have concerns. It's okay to have questions. And as a parent, I would tell you both personally and professionally, have questions, ask questions. That's what we're here for. At the end of the day, all we're trying to do is to give people the information they need to make an informed decision. Mm-hmm. That's it. I want to respect people's autonomy. I want to respect where people are coming from, and no judgment. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I think vaccine fatigue, trust, complacency. Look, I get it. COVID-19, we're all a little bit fatigued about hearing about vaccines. It seems like every 5 minutes, it's like, oh, okay, now this, now that. What we need to do is just keep on keeping on, keep giving people the information that they need, be clear and concise and transparent. Follow the science. Another important thing that we do here at Vaccinate Your Family is storytelling. Science is great. Love the science, share the science all day long. But vaccination is also an emotional issue. And I can tell you personally, as many times as, I put my science hat on and I go out and I spout out all of this information, all of this science, and people are like, yep. I tell them my story and they're like, where do I go to get a flu shot? Science is definitely an important part of the conversation, but when you combine storytelling with that, you're touching their heart, you're relating to them. And again, as long as you lead with empathy and respect, again, we're not doing this to tell you what to do. We just want you to understand the susceptibility, and the severity. And that's what storytelling does. There's stories of loss like mine. There's also stories of survivorship. But when they're told in an empathic way, it's
Mhm.
meant to empower the person who's receiving that, right? Like, okay, now I know what I need to know so that I can make an informed decision about vaccination for myself, my
Right.
child, my loved one.
I love that so much. And there's a reason that science communication is even a thing now, because it's not just about what you're saying, it's how you're saying it, right? If people just wanted the science, they'd open up a science textbook, but it's more than that. We're human beings. There's, decision making is such a complex process, right? And as you said, there's the information and the facts and the science, but then there's also the emotional element and the human element. And I think that's spot on. So,
Yeah.
oops,
And
sorry, go on.
I'm going to share a real quick story with you, but
Yeah.
I'm going to be vulnerable with you and tell you my own story. So my daughter, when she was 12, it was time for her to get her HPV vaccine. So I'm sitting in my pediatrician's office. Now, mind you, I'm a scientist. I have lost one of my children to a vaccine-preventable disease. I'm a protective parent. I know vaccines. I know science. Pediatrician walks in and says, okay, it's time for Emma's first dose of the HPV vaccine. Back then, it was at the height of misinformation. I will be honest, I took a beat. For a moment, I was like having a panic attack going, my brain is telling me this, but my comfort level isn't there. So I said to my pediatrician, I said, can you please go out, give me a bunch of literature, bring it back in this room, and let's sit here and talk about it. And we did. And my daughter got her shot. She finished her series. But in that moment, I was a parent and I was a human being. I wasn't a
Mhm.
scientist. I wasn't someone who works in public health. So for me, I never lose sight of the fact of how emotional and sometimes gut wrenching it can be for people to make decisions about vaccination.
I'm so happy that you shared that, and there's absolutely no judgment. You were wearing your mama bear hat, and I
Yes.
I totally get that. It's interesting that you bring up the HPV vaccine because my mother actually, and I this was well, I was born. I'm sharing a lot of information now. How old am I? I'm 38 this year. So I don't back when I was a teenager. I remember my mom, she decided not to get me the
Mm.
vaccine. And it's because she was reading all of that information, the misinformation, and the overall takeaway for her was it's just too new. We don't have the data, we don't have the research. And actually, ultimately, I ended up getting HPV and going through this whole thing. I had the precancer cells, I had to have the colposcopy, I ended up being totally fine, and I've since cleared the virus.
Yeah.
But just a different outcome to the very same scenario that you found yourself in. Although my mother does not have a scientific background, which just a little bit of a distinction. But I get it, and there's no judgment. I understand, especially when you're dealing with this wild circus of misinformation on social media. And I shouldn't even say, I mean, sometimes, and I'm glad you made the distinction, and I've talked about it previously, between misinformation and disinformation. Obviously, it's intentionality and people who knowingly put out bad information. That's disinformation. But I think a lot of times misinformation is out there and reshared by people who actually don't have bad intentions, but they'll share something about a vaccine ingredient, or they'll take the big thing that I talk about is the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And look at how many people reported adverse events. The vaccines caused X, Y, and Z. Not realizing, of course, and we've talked about this previously on Unbiased Science, but that it's a passive reporting system. Anyone can file reports. We know, I mean, first of all, there are some reports that we know are falsified, but then even the legitimate reports, that's an example of correlation, not causation. And what it is, it's an early public health surveillance system. So when we see trends, if there is an uptick in a particular outcome being reported for a vaccine, it is rigorously investigated, and vaccines will be, told right away if there is a legitimate safety concern, right? But it's just an example of people will take that the VAERS reports, and then reshare it to their social media. And that leads to all kinds of concerns. And I get it. I get it. So what we're doing is we're trying to counter with the good information, but it's tough once when the horse has already left the stable or the barn or whatever that expression is.
Yeah, and I've seen it too, where one of my friends on a social media channel will share something quite innocently, but you're like, "Ooh, that's actually not correct," right? So
Yes.
it's hard to be a good consumer of information, and some people do it innocently because they don't know, and I try to use that as an opportunity for conversation.
Right. So I want to go through just briefly, some parents will delay vaccines or they will, forego them altogether or space them out or whatever. There's all kinds of stuff out there saying that you should space out vaccines more. And so I'm actually working on a post right now that will likely be published by the time this episode airs. I just want to kind of walk through for any folks who are listening and maybe have some questions about whether that's a good idea. Just want to underscore that the current vaccine schedule is optimized for immune system development, as well as timing for when kids would most likely encounter a disease. So delaying or spacing out vaccines from what is recommended leaves kids who are often the most vulnerable at risk. Let's see what else I want to emphasize here. I mean, in the post, I'll go through exactly why, like the first dose of the measles vaccine is recommended at 12 to 15 months. And why is that the case? So it's administered at this time to avoid interference from maternal antibodies, to ensure that the infant's immune system is mature enough, and also to provide protection before potential exposure, right? But I wanted to jump ahead here. Sorry, I'm scrolling through the content I'm working on here. I guess, there's this idea that our kids' immune systems can be overwhelmed, that there are too many shots, are they exposed to too many things? And the answer is no. Infants, kids, little ones are exposed to massive amounts of antigens from the moment we are born. Let's see what else I wanted to emphasize here. I mean, even like taking your kid to the playground, they're going to be exposed to more than they would if they were to get all of their vaccine, all the scheduled vaccines at the very same time. So, I mean, I understand in theory the concern, but in reality, that's just not a thing. The immune system is not going to be overwhelmed. And just going back to measles specifically, to the MMR vaccine, I've been getting a lot of questions. I mean, obviously, people are reading the news. They're getting nervous about the increase in cases, and now especially this child fatality in Canada. Can children receive a dose of the vaccine early? And the answer is yes. So the typical timing of the MMR vaccine is that a child will get their first dose at 12 to 15 months of age, and then dose 2 between 4 to 6 years of age. But the vaccine can be offered early depending on certain circumstances and reasons for potentially getting a shot early is if there's an outbreak, especially if you're living in an area with an outbreak where extra protection is necessary, international travel to areas with measles risk, or of course to catch up on a delayed vaccine schedule. So dose 1 can be given as early as 6 to 11 months of age, and dose 2 can be given as early as 28 days, so 4 weeks after the first dose, whenever they get that first dose. Per the CDC, if an infant receives a first dose of the MMR vaccine at 11 months or younger, they should then follow the recommended schedule and get another dose at 12 to 15 months, and then a final dose at 4 through 6 years. However, if a child receives only the second dose early, that will likely be considered an early dose, not an extra dose. But again, this is just something of a gray area. So it's something to talk about with your child's pediatrician. Serese, what else? Is there anything else that we didn't talk about today that you wish more people knew about vaccines or about measles in particular that you want to share with folks?
I would love if people would start thinking about vaccines as just a way we stay healthy, right? Like I think we all consider like, am I sleeping enough? Or hopefully we're considering, am I sleeping enough? Am I eating a good diet, right? When it comes to our children, are they, wearing their helmets when they're riding their bikes? Am I holding their hand when they're crossing the street? We do all of these things to keep ourselves and our loved ones healthy. Vaccines are just another way to do that. And I think, sometimes we take it for granted. Like in my generation, like I said, I was fully vaccinated. Here I am, a healthy adult, knock on wood. Um, you know, so I just want people to kind of start thinking about it like that. And to your earlier point, I mean, vaccines are so thoroughly tested. They're safe, they're effective, they're not 100%. But what's really important about vaccines is they help reduce those severe outcomes like hospitalization and death.
Mhm.
People do not identify as being high risk, even people with chronic medical conditions. But the reality of it is, and Joseph is a perfect example of this, we are all susceptible in some way, shape, or form, even healthy children and adults. There's nothing that puts us in a bubble and makes us untouchable. Even though we want to think that, when we think, oh, we're young, we're healthy, I'm not going to be that one person who gets really sick. We have a library of stories at Vaccinate Your Family. Stories just like Joseph's of loss and survivorship. So many of these people were just like Joseph, healthy, no underlying risk conditions. So again, let's just start thinking about vaccines as a way we stay healthy. We put on our seatbelts when we get in the car, or at least we should, because it's the law, you know. So let's just kind of think of it like that. And again, if you have questions and concerns, that is totally okay. We want to make sure that you have access to that information. If you're having trouble finding vaccines, if you're underinsured or uninsured, there is the Vaccines for Children program where children who qualify 18 years and younger can get free vaccines. So there are a lot of programs out there that if cost is a barrier for you or your family, there's ways to address that.
Cerise, can you say one more time what that program is for children under 18?
Yeah, it's called the Vaccines for Children program.
Okay.
So, any of the recommended vaccines for children and adolescents are available through that program. So, you can
Wow.
go on, and I will give you a link and perhaps you can
Please.
share it in the notes. Yeah, because
Absolutely.
we want people to know, if they're maybe living in an underserved area or they don't have insurance or they don't have a medical home, there's
Yeah.
still a way for them to get access to those vaccines.
I'm so happy to hear that. Do you happen to know offhand, just out of curiosity, if COVID is included in that? Um,
Ooh, that's a good question. I believe yes, because now it is an
it's
ACIP recommended vaccine.
recommended.
Yep.
Okay, and I'm asking because the CDC just or it's actually, sorry, I believe it is ending imminently its Bridge Access program,
In
which was in August. There you
yeah,
go. And I was really upset to hear that, but there's been very low demand for the COVID vaccines. I think there are other reasons, some funding issues that program is ending. So I'm thrilled to hear there's another resource. I will happily share it to show notes, and I will share it in our stories and make sure to get the word out.
yeah.
I'm sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say one more thing. If you are looking at vaccines.gov, you can go on there and find a COVID vaccine too, because, there are federally qualified health centers, there's rural health centers. So there are tools available and resources available. It's just a matter of getting connected to those.
Right. Now, I was actually getting ready to wrap up, but I have one more question for you because we've been talking a lot about mistrust, distrust of the government, CDC, the FDA, as well as pharma companies who are
Mhm.
producing these vaccines. Is there anything, what would you say to a person who says, well, I'm not going to get any vaccine because I don't trust these agencies. I don't trust pharma. They're selling us these products. They don't care about our health. They're trying to keep us sick, so they could sell us the cure, a lot of these things that we hear. How would you respond to that?
Oh gosh, that's such a hard question, but I think, you know, the evidence is there, the science is there. And I get the trust issue. We all have that circle of trust, right? Like we all have those people that we go to that when we have tough questions. So if you have a trusted healthcare provider, ask them questions. That's what they're there for.
Right.
If you don't have a medical home and you're looking for information, vaccinateyourfamily.org. You can visit our website. We have a lot of information on there. I would say, again, for me, vaccination is a way we keep ourselves and our families healthy. It is just important as sleeping, eating nutritious food, all of those other ways that we take care of ourselves and our families. So I would say make it a priority. I understand you may have concerns, and that is entirely okay.
Mm-hmm.
Just please, please, please seek out a resource where you can get the answers to those questions.
Yeah, I think that's all really great guidance. I think that's been the most challenging thing for me. It's like, how do you address this fundamental mistrust, distrust of these agencies or companies? And it's tough because I'm not going to sit here and say that, pharma is motivated by humanitarian,
Mm.
reason. It is. These are for profit. That is a for profit entity, pharmaceutical
Right.
companies. I'm not talking about government right now. And it's tough, but at the same time, I would say that you'd be hard pressed to find a person or an organization that isn't, there is always an element of financial viability and profit, right? I think another tactic that I sometimes take, and it's sometimes effective, it's not so great at building the trust in those agencies or companies, but it's helpful to help people confront some of their own cognitive dissonance or biases when they won't get a vaccine, but then they'll take a supplement, which, we know the supplement industry is a trillion-dollar industry at this point, the
Yeah.
wellness industry. And the difference is, they're both for profit, right? Pharma and the supplement industry, but one is very closely regulated. And that's the
Yeah.
big difference. So helping people, it's like, you're so willing to take that supplement or that powder, whatever, milkshake or whatever it is that people are having, but those are not regulated or studied for safety and effectiveness and held to that same standard. So I use that sometimes. Yeah.
And not just that, but I think about this quite often too. Like, even like our shampoo, our conditioner, our body lotion, our clothes, the things in our household, like we're not anywhere near as prescriptive when it comes to, oh, I'm not sure what's in that shampoo. I don't know if I want to use it. There's a bunch of ingredients in there I can't even pronounce, but I'm like, okay, sure.
Right.
But when it comes to vaccines, we're like, get out the magnifying glass. If you stop for a moment and think about that, and I'm pro vitamin too. I am not knocking vitamins. I take my multivitamin every day. But you're absolutely right that we don't seem to give a second thought to some of the products that we come into contact with on a daily basis. But when it comes to vaccines, it's like, oh, hold up. Well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That's
No, you're so right. And I have this theory. It's not others have said this. I'm not the one who's invented this, but there's something about like the fact that it's a needle going in our body, something about the mode, the injection. There's something that is off-putting to people. Anyway, it is an interesting,
yeah.
just a lot of different layers, a lot of different reasons here.
Yeah, no, and I get
Yeah.
it. It's funny because I was in the hair salon a while ago, and this is not a judgmental observation, but a lot of women are doing injectables, and they were talking about it in the hair salon, and in the next breath, they were like, but those COVID vaccines. And I kind of like just had to giggle to myself
You're
because I was
right.
like, you realize that doesn't sound right. Like, they're both injectables, but you're questioning
Exactly.
one and not the other.
Right. And oh my gosh, I mean, I don't know if folks know that like nothing has been studied or monitored more than the COVID vaccines, or honestly, vaccines in general. There are
Yes.
so many. And I'm talking outside of pharma, outside of government. You have academic institutions, independent organizations, third parties doing this intensive monitoring for safety and effectiveness of these vaccines. All eyes are on these vaccines, So anyway, Serese, thank you so very much for joining me today. Thank you for the work you're doing through Vaccinate Your Family. One more time, where can folks follow along or get involved?
So you can visit vaccinateyourfamily.org. There is a wealth of information on there. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, whatever it is we're calling that now, LinkedIn. So yes, please do follow us for information. If you are interested in getting involved in some advocacy efforts, you can reach us through info@vaccinateyourfamily.org as well. So please do reach out. We are here to help guide, educate, empower.
You are amazing. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for telling us about Joseph and your journey and just everything you've done. It's incredible. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. Hope that you learned something from this episode. Remember that we have a searchable database. And I have to check this is embarrassing. uspodsources.com is the link to our searchable database. So if you have questions about measles, the MMR vaccine, or just anything, you can search by keyword. Remember that we have a weekly newsletter on Substack. It's free to subscribe, although there is a paid option if you're able and willing to support our science communication efforts. You can sign up for that at unbiasedscipod.substack.com, and I'll link to this in all of our show notes. And sorry, I'm having do you see I'm blanking on all of these links and addresses. I don't know what's going on with me right now. Anyway, thank you all so very much for tuning in for No Nonsense, Just Science.